Good evening and welcome to 2022. We are overtime here on WOTM. I'm Gerhard Mathangani, joined by our expert researcher / historian, Mark Everett Kelly. There's a lot to talk about after a really kind of a crazy few days in the college football world, the NFL world, as well as college basketball. We'll dive into all of them. Let's start in college football. Obviously, the semifinals are now in the books. A lot of what we expected kind of came to fruition. Two games that weren't necessarily close, had opportunities to be close. But Bama knocked off Cincinnati. Georgia knocked off Michigan. We now have our championship game set. Let's start with the Crimson Tide and Cincinnati Bearcats. This was a game early on that I think a lot of people were a little bit surprised by. But then Bama ended up coming away with that win, 27-6. What was your takeaway from the Tide's victory and punching their ticket to the championship?
Consider that Alabama had nothing to prove, where Cincinnati had everything to prove. And Cincinnati's been waiting for an opportunity like this. They get, I don't want to say they got a break, but other things had to happen. Other teams had to lose for them to be in the playoff. So now's their chance. They know if they don't perform well, they might not ever get another shot. As long as we stay with this format, and who knows how long that's going to be,
right,
based on whether they extend it or not, when it's finished in 2025, or they try to do that beforehand. So Cincinnati had a lot to play for, and you expected them to give Alabama everything they could. And Alabama, coming off that big win against Georgia, maybe was feeling their oats a little bit, because remember how much they felt disrespected going into that Georgia game.
Right.
So it was kind of the opposite here. But I thought they did exactly what you would expect them to do against a very good opponent, because Cincinnati is very good. Outside of Georgia, they were the only team to be in a top 10 in points per game and points per game allowed. So those things really mattered when overall you're assessing how to attack a football team. Alabama ran the ball pretty much down their throat, over 300 yards rushing. The previous time they had over 300 yards rushing was against Ole Miss last year.
Right.
And everyone remembered the offensive explosion of that game. Passing the ball, they didn't really have the consistency that you saw against Georgia, who you would expect. Well, I mean, how much better of a pass defense can Cincinnati be than Georgia's? But Cincinnati, that's really where they made their bread this year,
right,
is defending the pass. So they pressured Bryce Young. They made a lot of things difficult for him. And I think he stood up well over what he saw, which was probably the second best defense that he's ever going to see this year, or maybe in his college career, because Georgia, when they come out in the national championship game, will probably have a few more things and a few more looks for him to adjust to. But I thought he handled it well. They stayed with what they did well, which was run the ball. They dominated right away coming out that opening drive. But defensively is where I was really impressed, because that's what you've been waiting for.
Right.
Is this defense was supposed to be the strength of the team while Bryce Young learned, while they got used to their younger wide receivers. And you finally saw in this game holding Cincinnati, which averaged 39 points a game and averaged almost 424 yards per game, holding them to 218 total yards, holding them to only their lowest total passing the ball as well. They had 6 sacks. You saw Dallas Turner, who I love. I mean, he is a guy that's really going to come into his own.
For sure.
And he's going to grow like Will Anderson did this year. Then you had Will Anderson on the other side. Who knows if they'll get Christopher Allen back for the national championship game. They say he made the trip to the Cotton Bowl. He's been practicing, but I don't know if he'll be ready. But Alabama's defense is starting to mold into what's going to be a very dominant defense next year. And you saw that in this game, because just like that play, I thought that was at the end of Cincinnati's first drive. Now consider that Cincinnati had 10 drives, and in 5 of those drives they went 3 and out.
Right.
So that was really one of they only had 2 drives where they held the ball for at least 4 minutes, and that was one of them. So Alabama did a lot of what you expect them to do, a dominant defense to do in a game that matters. I'm real curious to see how that's going to translate into Georgia the second time. But I'm glad that we do get a chance to see the 2 best teams in college football this year play for a second time.
Exactly. We'll get into maybe the argument about an expansion and if that would even work, considering what both these semifinal games were. Meanwhile, Alabama head coach Nick Saban took the podium today to talk about that rematch, and Mark and I will talk about that in just a bit. But he talked about what will be different in the preparation leading up to the big game 1 week from today against the Georgia Bulldogs.
Well, I think, it sort of speaks to itself in terms of, we're obviously going to evaluate how we did in the last game. They're going to evaluate how they did in the last game. They're going to try to take advantages of things that we did. We're going to try to take advantage of things and correct things that we didn't do well. And I think in that, there are some subtle changes that you need to make so that you put your players in the best chance to be successful. You're always going to see something new and different, so players are going to always have to adapt in the game. I don't think you do everything the same, but I also don't think you can make, a lot of changes that the players are not going to go out and be able to play and execute with confidence. So the changes you need to make, sort of relative to the things that you did well or didn't do, and some of the things that they were able to take advantage of that you need to make sure you make adjustment to.
Let's flip to the other side. Before we talk about the rematch, what would you make of Michigan and Georgia? That was probably the more hyped game going into this Final Four, going into the championship round, is if that game could be a good one after what we saw Michigan do against a really good Ohio State football team. What was your takeaway from the Bulldogs after putting up 34 in that 34-11 win?
Because they dominated Ohio State the way they did, you expected to see maybe a better effort by Michigan out there. But if you're playing Georgia, Georgia destroyed everybody this year, with the exception of Alabama. So they were the better team, and they played like it, and they did what they were supposed to do. Michigan still isn't at that level yet. I'm sorry if that hurts to hear, but they're not. I mean, we saw Ohio State last year, a very good Ohio State team, just get annihilated by Alabama. So while the mediocre teams in the SEC are probably not any better than the mediocre teams in the Big Ten, the big dogs in the SEC are still much better than the big dogs in the Big Ten.
Exactly, and now that we look ahead to that matchup, one of the big things that you have to take a look at are some of the things that we saw in Atlanta and what could change if nothing else. Stetson Bennett, there was a lot of questions about him coming up after that, the game in Atlanta. He stepped up big time, 20 of 30, over 300 yards, 3 touchdowns. Do you think he can have a repeat performance in the national championship game a week from today, considering what he did against a pretty solid defense in Michigan? Or do you still expect to see Alabama give him troubles in the same way they gave him trouble in the matchup number 1?
Well, we had the pleasure of talking with Howie Schwab beforehand,
right.
Which, by the way, we did an interview with Howie on Zoom, but because I had a little difficulty with, normally I put on a setting that it records automatically. It didn't, so I really apologize to you and to Howie, who was nice enough to give us a lot of time today on a day he really didn't feel well, so my apologies there. But when I brought up numbers to Howie as Alabama's dominance over Georgia, that they've won 34 straight against the SEC East, which is no small number.
Oh, for sure.
They've won 7 straight against Georgia. And there is a mental effect that they have and a mental edge that they have over Georgia because they've outscored them 69-21 in the second half over their last 4 meetings, including 17-7 when they played a couple weeks ago. So that's something. Georgia's had a double-digit lead in the last 4 games, and they haven't been able to hold on. They had a 10-0 lead in the game on December 6th. So how can Georgia put their foot down and go for the kill against Alabama? We haven't seen them do that, and part of the reason is because of Stetson Bennett. Because he doesn't have the necessary skills that you can't prepare for. The ability, like Bryce Young, to take matters into his own hands when everything breaks down and create a play that's going to cause the defense to jump back on their heels. He doesn't have that. That's a big ability in college football now. In the NFL now, a lot of teams are depending on that broken play ability that you can't prepare for. So that's probably the biggest thing against him, and that's not going to happen. It's just he doesn't have that ability. So you don't have to worry about preparing for that. But I do think that Georgia, the edge Georgia has now is that they lost a couple weeks ago. They had everybody saying the things that Alabama had to hear going into that game. And everyone knows that Georgia's ability to beat Alabama is the only thing that they have to prove. And I think they wanted this game. Obviously, we get a rematch that they're prepared for and they're ready for, so there's no more sneaking around. There's no more Alabama's disrespected and they go into the game as an underdog and people aren't expecting them. No, Alabama proved that they're Alabama. They proved that they can still play with Georgia no matter how Georgia how great Georgia's been. Consider the fact that Georgia only allowed 83 points total before that game,
right,
and 41 against Alabama. So all those things embarrassed them. I think they're really embarrassed. And even though Alabama has a definite mental edge, when you've been embarrassed like that, you can either stand up like a man and face it, or you can cower. I don't expect them to cower. I don't expect that out of Kirby Smart. I don't expect that out of his players. So we'll see what happens in the game. That's why I didn't want to see Alabama celebrate too much when they did.
Right.
Because then the rub-it-in factor gets a little bit more. But I thought they handled it well. They didn't really scream and flaunt the fact that they beat Georgia in the SEC championship game, because they knew they would have to play them again most likely, and they will. So that's what I'm really looking forward to.
Exactly. And there's a lot of things I think topically will be different about this game. Obviously, I think Stetson Bennett will play better in this game, but Bama's also walking into this one without John Mechie. They had him in that first matchup. We'll see how it all rolls out. Coming up in Indianapolis 1 week from today. Coming up next here on Overtime, we'll talk a little bit more football. We'll also talk a little college basketball. It's been a big week so far, big weekend. We'll talk about it coming up next.